everyone. This is Tom from Certified. Sorry about that delay. I hit the cancel call versus the unmute, so I'm sure we've all been there. Anyway, for those of you that I haven't had the privilege to meet, I'm Tom Cronkright. I'm one of the co-founders of Certified, also a large title agency owner in Michigan and a wire fraud victim. So today I'm excited because we are going to dive fairly deep for the first half, so roughly 20 minutes. I want to unpack basically the money laundering network and share with you what we learned through our wire fraud experience. And I want to spend the second half dissecting kind of an hour-by-hour roadmap of how you would recover, what things you would need to do if you or one of your customers was hit with a wire fraud. And God willing, that'll never happen, but I think you'll see that it's important to have an understanding of how to respond. So by way of housekeeping, a couple things. I want to hear from your question. I want to hear from you. If you have questions, you have a questions panel in the go-to meeting, and just start putting those in there, and my team here will start to feed those to me in real time, and we'll have enough time for a question and answer. And then for next month's webinar, the same link that you registered for this month, you can go ahead and register for next month. So what was interesting is the last couple days, I was in Raleigh with the Alta Innovation Summit that they put on about wire fraud and cybersecurity and data protection, and it was absolutely fascinating. So not only was I able to share some information as being one of the speaker or instructor members, but I also attended as a participant in the industry. And I can tell you that this issue that we're about to talk about and what we've talked about in previous monthly briefings is something that I think it really is mission critical. And the companies like yourself that are getting the continual education and awareness and then start to do things in response are frankly going to be here in the next year or 3 or 5, where others won't. I mean, the issue is moving so quickly and so intensely that, again, we have to do the work and take this on. So what I'm going to talk about today, we got kind of a packed agenda, which we always do, but we'll get through it. What is money laundering? How big is it? Let's talk about the Money Mule network, top strategies, and then our experience. So our experience was a super intense one. I haven't shared it publicly in an open forum like this, but I'm happy to for the first time. And then what does it look like to recover if we do have an incident, because minutes matter from a strategic perspective. We've talked about the roadmap over the last few series, how they profile transactions, they fish someone in a deal, they access an email account, they monitor transaction level information, they obtain that information. Then we as transaction participants get spoofed or impersonated. Someone is manipulated into transferring funds. So now we're kind of at the end of this roadmap. And the question that I had, and many of you may have, is why can't the banks just shut this down? Like how can they allow these fraudulent accounts or these accounts that end up participating in fraudulent activity like money muling? Why can't those be detected and just and quickly shut down? And I think after this session you'll appreciate just the challenges that the financial industry has. And I'm not defending either way. I'm kind of agnostic on this, but I'm more informed in the sense that it's a real big challenge and it continues to grow because of how they're recruiting money mules to move funds. So what is money laundering? There actually is a formal definition. And it is the process of concealing the origins of money obtained illegally by passing it through these layers of sequenced transactions. So you're laundering or you're washing funds through a series of transactions in accounts that may look legitimate, but the origin point is something that is fraudulent. The phases are 3 significant phases. So you place money, so placement is the first. You place money into the financial system, okay? Then you start to layer transactions so that you're camouflaging the actual source of the funds. And I'll dissect this with how the money mules moved our $180,000 that we were defrauded out of in 2015. And then the last is integration, where you're acquiring wealth through this generated funds, because at some point it's converted. So you end up with illegal funds that are placed into accounts. They layer these transactions, and ultimately there's a conversion typically to another form of an asset, either real estate or personal property, or now even cryptocurrency that we're going to get into. So think of it as, again, all this has a very significant methodology. One of the speakers yesterday, as we were ending the session in Raleigh, said something. He's a well-known guy in the industry. And he said, if you had an $8 billion business that you were able to take from basically zero, and now it's $8 billion in a matter of a few years, would you give that up? Because that's the size of the network that we're talking about and how much money they're generating from wire fraud, from ransomware, from data theft, from those things. And the answer is no. So where do they originate from? You have to understand that it's a complex kind of web, and it's multifaceted. So they have multiple different vectors of originating funds, okay? Business email compromise, and I'm going to unpack some stats that are fresh that we received from the FBI, okay? Business email compromise is a type of fraud targeted to redirect wire or ACH transfers from businesses or individuals, okay? That's the target of BEC. So think of it as like wire fraud. Online job scams. So hey, work from home. You guys have seen those stapled up on telephone poles, or you've seen them on Craigslist. Work from home for $25 an hour. And I'll show you some of the recruiting tools for Money Mules. Romance scams. This is a absolute heartbreaking and devastating scam for so many individuals around the country. And I got very close to this during our trial because we were wrapped up in a bunch of romance scam victims. Mystery shopper scams, advance fee, reshipping, grandparents. I mean, and then it gets a lot more, I wouldn't say sinister, but kind of heavy with drug trafficking and human trafficking. So just know it's not just one thing. And I tell people they're kind of crime agnostic, they're brand agnostic, they're transaction agnostic. They just want to generate funds and start to run that through the mill of money laundering, both domestically and internationally. So what's the size and scope of the problem? The most recent estimate that we saw was it's generating about $300 billion in potential money laundering proceeds on an annual basis. I mean, it's just massive amounts of money that are being moved. So last week, before the event in Raleigh, I actually went through the IC3 reports again. And it had been a while since I sat them side by side. And I'm sorry, what's an IC3 report? So the FBI set up the Internet Crime Complaint Center, and it's ic3.gov. And if you go there, you'll be able to pull down FBI bulletins. And on the right, kind of on the bottom, it says, maybe we can put that, Brent, in the chat, put the link to the IC3. We'll throw that up for you guys right now. This is where you can read the annual reports, and you need to read the annual reports. They're fascinating because they're showing different strategies and trend lines. So I wanted to focus on business email compromise, okay, the issue that we're facing with wire fraud and, let's say, real estate and other financial transactions. So if you look at what's reported, you can see that the complaints went from a very low number, and then people had visibility of where the FBI wanted these claims to funnel through. So we get more and more complaints as more and more activity comes in. And in 2017, they're reporting roughly 11 to 12,000 complaints, okay, with losses of, roughly $600 and some thousand dollars. But they're about ready. If you look at the trend line of what was reported late 2017 and then into spring of last year, we're going to report that the losses are $1.5 billion, with complaints, if you kind of cast this out, now spiking to roughly 35,000. So the report that we're going to get next month or the month after is going to show a significant tilt in kind of the aperture of this issue. Well, what's interesting is that is basically, this graph here is shown here, but there's roughly only 15% of what's actually taking place that's getting reported. So if you normalize that number, the activity level is actually much higher, in the sense that we're probably looking at, a few 100,000 instances over, or actually 20,000 instances, I'm sorry, with, roughly 10 to 12 billion in loss. Okay, because, I've had on our brand in the title company different attempts last year. I didn't report those. Some of them will report to the IC3, some we won't. But the reputational risk and branding risk of having a news station show up and say, hey, you didn't have a loss, but you had an attempt. Is there something wrong with your brand? It can get twisted really quick. And I empathize with all of you that are going through that same issue. But as I looked at these graphs, and I'm talking to many of you around the country, either at national events or as we're looking to implement the certified solution, it just seemed like the loss was bigger. It seemed like the instances were much greater than even what is extrapolated here. So I actually sent a FOIA request to the FBI last year. So it's a Freedom of Information Act request, and any governmental entity has to respond if they're obligated and can to the request. And I won't bore you with the back and forth of the 4 months of negotiating and what was going to be released, but ultimately this is what we released. So now if I normalize this number, it falls way down here, and the FBI from the IC3 website had instances from June of 2016 to roughly the end of last year where people went onto the IC3 and were reporting a wire fraud incident. Not necessarily a loss, but they went onto the IC3 and said, I have a wire fraud incident. Well, that crested to 80,000 over, $90 billion that were reported. So if that includes only 15%, now you're cresting several hundred, almost $1 trillion of attempts. So what I was explaining in Raleigh in the last few days is what we think we know about this issue. We're hearing just a small fraction of those people that unfortunately lost funds. The retired couple buying their dream home and their life savings is whisked away in an instant because the wire gets rediverted. A millennial couple that's been saving for, 3 years to buy a house are suddenly, without a place to live. You've heard the heartbreaking stories. But just know, and I'm going to pivot to solution very quickly, is look, it's just simply bigger than we have our heads around. And I was surprised when I got this number because I was expecting something closer to a middle range here of activity. So let's talk about money muling. So what is a money mule and why is it so hard to stop? So one of the things that I've been beating my head against the wall and just is frustrating because we've had so many fraud attempts and we were, obviously we were hit, is why can't the bank identify with the know your customer requirements and the other things that Dodd-Frank and other regulations require from them? How do you not know your customer well enough that you could see kind of on a future state that something bad is likely going to happen? Well, I think over the next couple minutes here, we're going to unpack what they're struggling with and how it's nearly undetectable on the front end. So a money mule, think of it as someone who transfers illegally acquired money on behalf or at the direction of another. And they recruit these mules to move money electronically through these bank accounts through a variety of different ways. And these money mules fall into 3 kind of categories. So if you haven't seen it, the FBI in December put together a really good piece on money muling. And you can find it online. And I'm borrowing some of that content here. So you have the unknowing or unwitting, meaning I think I'm just helping somebody out. I thought this was a legitimate job. I'm not trying to break the law. I'm just engaging like I'm being asked to engage. So they really have no knowledge that they're working probably for an international cybercrime syndicate to launder illegal funds through a bank account as part of this function that is a ruse, frankly, to get them to do that. The next is witting, where I suspect something, but I'm not going to ask too many questions because I kind of like this flexible arrangement I have, and it's easy to go to the bank, deposit some checks. wire some funds, kind of a, don't ask, don't tell type of thing where I'm just going to play along with this, right? Dangerous place to be. And then those that raise their hand and say, you know what, I'll help you do this international syndicate. I want to be a professional money mule. And we ran into 2 of those in our fraud. So know that this is the toughest right here, and this is what they're targeting, is how do we get people that believe they're doing something lawful that could benefit them and maybe this cause that they're helping out with, but in fact they're working for illegal gain. So how do they do it? They do it for a variety of reasons or ways. So Compliance Alert had a really good graph I'm borrowing right now that it could come through an online posting, some social media feed, direct contact, so they could actually kind of spear in and target someone of a certain profile. What's interesting is folks that are kind of new to the country, unemployed, looking for an opportunity to get their feet under them are big targets, as are men between a certain age of 18 and 34. They just have more of a aptitude to respond to these things. And it looks like some type of a legitimate job or cause that they're supporting. And what they're doing is they're asking the mule to say, hey, you have the ability to go in and we're asking you to open up accounts, receive funds, and move those funds to other accounts. The FBI has a significant awareness campaign running on this, in the sense that the hashtag Don't Be a Mule. And like I say, if you look at this, they have a bunch of materials on it. And the penalties. So the penalties from a federal standpoint, because a lot of times when you transfer funds across state lines, it becomes a federal offense. The state loses jurisdiction. So you have mail fraud, which is a sheet of glass wide, but comes with a big stick from a fine and a possible imprisonment standpoint. Wire fraud. So all of these could be layered into the different fraud attempts. If you look at the recent college scandal that's taking place in the news, look at how many counts that line up with this are in those indictments, right? Almost nearly all of them, except maybe money laundering. It's a big issue. But you can see here that 20 years, 20 years, 30 years, 20 years, 20 years, in each one of those instances that the U.S. Attorney's Office can prove if they prosecute. So let me go back to something. Let me give you an example of recruiting a money mule. And I learned this during our trial experience. So let's say that I'm a fan of a certain rock band, okay? And as part of that, I'm part of a fan club on Facebook. I'm like a super fan. They can see I'm super active, I'm posting, I'm sharing, I'm doing all these things. And one of the band members becomes ill with some sort of an incident. I don't know what, a medical issue, okay? And it was kind of life-threatening for a while, but he or she healed from that. And then the fraudsters, because it's all public and it's on Facebook, they say, wait a minute, here's an opportunity. So they pose as the manager of this rock band, for example, and they go to their super fans in different areas of the country and they reach out and say, hey, I'm the manager of so-and-so. You probably heard all over the news and on Facebook that, there was that medical incident, and he or she wants to set up a charity to prevent this from happening in the future. And they thought that the best way to get the word out were some of the most active fans on social media. We want to start there first. Would you be interested? And as a super fan, I'm like, oh, yeah, this is fantastic. I'm so glad he or she was healed. I'd love to participate. This sounds like a great social cause. Awesome. And then down the rabbit hole we go, where they explain, look, to do this, I need you to walk into a bank and I need you to open up a few accounts because we're going to be receiving money from people donating funds for this cause. Can you do that? Sure. So think about it. I walk into a bank. The bank sees me as, hey, you got perfect credit, no flags on the background check, know your customer boxes checked all over the place, and I open an account for whatever, Acme Charity. And I start depositing checks and receiving wires, and at some point they say, hey, great job. We have some causes now. We have some children or whatever that are going through this, and we want to start to fund some hospitals, or we want to fund some other companies that will start to distribute this directly to people suffering from that same disease. Can now you move the money? Can you transfer the money to some of these different accounts? Some of them are going to be by certified check that you have to overnight, some of them by wire transfer. Sure, I'll do that. So now I feel like I'm doing something, right? I took the money in, and now I'm helping people as I push it out. What you're doing is you're pushing out to another money mule in another part of the country, part of the same scam, and you're starting to launder and wash funds. The other thing they're doing is they're seasoning these accounts. And what I mean by that is if the average wire transfer in real estate is, for the sake of argument, 200 grand, that's roughly the amount that we see over and over, 180 to 230,000 lost. They will actually season them so they start to transfer in blocks of 180 to 250 from other accounts, right? So they're just moving this money around the country to themselves, basically, so that when the fraudulent payment comes in, it's likely going to go undetected. By contrast, if I was taking in deposits of $3,500 or $800 or $8,000 at a maximum, and then I get a block of $500,000 in, a lot of systems now with banks, thankfully, will flag that and say something looks suspicious. So just know that this is a huge challenge, because when you walk in the front door of that branch, it's somebody that is a law-abiding citizen thinking they're helping someone to do something good, when in fact behind the curtain is a very sinister plan to recruit them and activate them as money mules, okay? All right, so how do they mule to avoid detection? So I want to show you kind of the evolution of what's being happened, and we saw this in ours. First, when you wire funds to a fraudulent account, it always ends up in one account, right? One big block gets sent from your bank to what you think is the right destination, but it's diverted to another account at another bank. And they always give you the right wiring instructions, believe me. They're not going to send you wiring or payment information if it's for some place that it's not going to land. So it lands at a destination unknown, but a legitimate destination. And then they start to splinter that. They start to mule that through our network. A lot of times they'll pull it out in cash. They may send it to Western Union, maybe immediately pay off a credit card, put it on as a down payment on real estate, maybe some commodities. All that happened in our 180,000 within a few hours. But now they're getting smarter, and they're saying, look, that takes some time, right, to break these packets up and spread it around the country. So what about online payments? Could we start to move it quicker and convert it faster through some of these online portals? And now we're seeing, and that takes hours, now we're seeing where they'll take it from US dollars, convert it to one of the crypto wallets, and then reconvert it to a different fiat currency overseas, and then mule it overseas. This is the future state, and this is the real challenge I think that we face, and we've seen instances of this year, where the level of sophistication, and guess what? They're training the money mules on how to think about this. Cryptocurrency is a fairly sophisticated transfer. It's not hard to do, but it's pretty sophisticated. To take money from an account and convert it to a crypto wallet, even setting up a crypto wallet, it doesn't take a lot of time, but to get your head around it. They have basically a how-to that if I'm recruited as a money mule, not only am I opening up these accounts, but I have this convert to cryptocurrency for dummies video that I watch, and then it trains me how to open up the wallet and then quickly sweep it into a cryptocurrency. And I don't really know what I'm doing, right? We've seen instances of that. The chances of recovery here, as you can imagine, become exponentially more difficult because cryptocurrency is kind of this amorphous idea. What really is it? But what it can be converted to other fiat currencies in different countries without having to go through the international banking system. So just know, be alert for that. So our fraud experience, and then I want to get to the wire fraud recovery roadmap. Our experience was a pretty intense one. So we were hit with a $180,000 fraud. What really happened was we took a cashier's check in for $185,000 on a commercial property in the southeast side of Grand Rapids. And after due diligence closed, but we had deposited this check for a few days in the banking system, we were asked to wire 180 of that 185 to the seller for hard money or hard money EMD, earnest money, to the seller. So we would never do it again. Not entirely uncommon, but the amount was uncommon looking back. but the check had been deposited, had no flags, you know, that whole thing. And then after being in the banking system for several days and the wire had been gone, the check bounced. I mean, it was a shocking event. We were out 180 that instant. What we didn't realize that I'm going to unfold for you was just simply how sophisticated the network was that hit us with our fraud. And this is conservative, you know, West Michigan, a place that you think this is the last place that a fraudster is looking. So our money went from our bank in Grand Rapids to a bank in New York, right? One of the largest financial institutions in the world. What we didn't know is that an international money mule by the name of Antonella Mendelsohn had flown in the day before from Germany with instructions that said, get to New York, and await further instructions. We're going to receive a wire likely tomorrow. So this is her and her husband. The timestamp on it's hard to read, but it's on April 10th of 2015 at 12:01. This is her moving our money and breaking up into 3 different wires. She received her instructions earlier that morning at 9:42. So this is happening in real time. And what this is telling her is, and this is from a person involved in, you'll see the Nigerian cyber syndicate in a second, right? So this is a global direction from this person that was in New York. Take 40 out here, push a wire there, and then she was allowed to take out 20, and she got back on a plane to Germany. That was her whole job, okay? But think about the timing of that. Go to the country, await further instructions. Roughly 2 hours before she shows up, the instructions come through. What we didn't realize is what was going to unfold next, and that is our money ended up in the hands of a cast of characters, I call it, down in Texas. Perez Cortez, this guy in the center, they call him Perry at the federal level, was an attorney that was laundering money through his attorney trust account. Okay, so he had a bulk of our funds. And why they're hiring attorneys, so think about this. They're recruiting attorneys knowingly, okay, that if a company like ours loses money and we file an injunctive order, we somehow press the bank to freeze an account. So we froze his attorney trust account. As an attorney, he's hired by the cyber syndicate network to go absolutely ballistic on bank counsel and threaten all kinds of litigation if those funds are not unfrozen because of a lack of due diligence and the ability, like you just can't do this automatically without us having a say in what happens. And they're very successful at it. Okay, then Dean Morgan. So Dean Morgan owned Morgan Insurance and Dean Morgan Realty, and he put a down payment on a piece of property, okay? Mark Hopkins was a guy that put a down payment on a container of aluminum ingots that were originating from overseas, like little aluminum pellets, if you will. And then Priscilla Ellis was ex-U.S. military, professional international laundering mule, okay? Like actively, hey, I'm here, I can get a lot done in the U.S. What was interesting, though, is we had to civilly litigate to recover our funds. So if you think about like spring of 2015, nobody was talking about wire fraud in real estate, okay? There just wasn't the awareness, there wasn't the roadmap. We had to kind of figure this out on our own. So we sued everyone that we could find, including this Mark Hopkins guy. So what was interesting there is Mark Hopkins, we litigated for 2 years. We settled with Mark Hopkins' lawyer, and this was at the end of first quarter of 2017. We recovered roughly 140 of our 180. And then my phone rang in June of 2017. And it was the U.S. Attorney's Office out of Tampa, Florida. And he started to ask me, the U.S. District Attorney, who is a phenomenal guy, said, look, I need to talk to you about your civil litigation in Texas. So we start to answer, questions about, what do you know about Perry? What do you know about Dean? Tell me about Mark. So he starts to hone in on Mark Hopkins and what I knew and the counsel that was representing him and this and that. And then it ultimately came out that there was no Mark Hopkins. I said, what do you mean? I just settled with his lawyers 3 months ago. He said, well, what we found is that Mark Hopkins, because you named these other individuals, is actually an alias of one of the main cyber syndicate leaders in North America called Ikachiwu Amadi. They call him Ike, this guy right here, upper right corner. And Ike is responsible for running the North American syndicate of the Nigerian Black Axe. And that's where I knew the conversation was pivoting in a much different direction, right? So if you back up just 60 days from this phone call, there was an FBI bulletin that actually profiled the kind of Texas fraud syndicate and referenced that Priscilla Ellis actually tried to take a hit out on a few witnesses that were going to be testifying in her trial and got an additional like 66 years added to her sentence. So as Patrick is relaying this information on the phone, I said, hey, Patrick, the U.S. attorney, I said, did you read the bulletin from the FBI? Because these don't seem like really good people. Why are you calling me? And the reason for the call is that they connected through the civil litigation and other information that Ike and his brother Desmond were really the #1 and #2 guys in North America. And they had picked up Desmond, and I was about ready to receive a grand jury subpoena to come down and testify so that they could extradite him for trial in the U.S. As you can imagine, a disconcerting conversation followed with the U.S. Attorney's Office. We worked it out. I did it through affidavit. They extradited him, and ultimately, they were going to try to do a plea deal to get further up into the network, which ultimately fell apart. Okay, so that fell apart actually in the summer of last year, where I was then called to testify live for Desmond's trial, along with 8 other victim witnesses, and had to do that under an FBI detail, obviously for security reasons. And I only share this story with you because it's one thing to say, okay, I lost 180, and thankfully we're in a financial position where, yeah, it sucks, but you can make that whole. But if you're called to go kind of the distance on this, when you need to bring people to justice, you're in a completely different realm of impact for your business and your life. So as it unfolded, I started to get Department of Correction letters from the U.S. Department of Corrections and realized that our money had actually spanned through 7 different states. The network included 5 countries that I was unaware of. And like I say, the testimony included not only the subpoena for the grand jury, but also actual trial. So I can't express enough that this is something that you would just want to avoid if you can, and you want your clients to avoid it as well because it's incredibly disruptive. So that's our experience. We consider it, we call it tuition. So we look at everything that happens for a reason, and now we're not only on the path to try to alleviate wire fraud, starting in the real estate transactions, but also what we're doing in our business as we service our customers, really, like I say, doing the reps, doing the work, and making the investment so that it wouldn't happen to others. So pivoting to solution, what happens if you have a wire fraud and you need to recover? So in the chat panel, correct, we are putting a link to our white paper that we published, sometime early last year called When Minutes Matter. I'm redacting some of this information to show you what you need to do on an hour-by-hour basis that will increase your chances of recovery. So hear me, this is not a 100% guarantee that you'll recover anything because the timing and the sophistication of this is moving so quickly that they're trying to do everything they can to avoid detection. But if you want to better your chances, this is what we found from a roadmap perspective. So we lived this in how we were initiating our recall in our fund recovery, but also recently we actually participated just to help people out in a few different recalls, and it actually worked. So not all of it, but the maximum amount you could. First hour, you got to notify the bank and you have to initiate a SWIFT recall. So let me go to 40,000 feet. If you're hit with a wire fraud or you learn your customer is hit by a wire fraud, you got to go a little crazy on the banks and the FBI and counsel. I mean, you think of yourself as your patient advocate in a situation that is life-threatening. There isn't anything you won't do. There isn't any stone you won't unturn, and anything you will, you just have to get the information in real time. So you call your bank, You demand that the SWIFT recall, and you have to confirm that the funds are in kind of a hold or frozen status. And then ask them, did the funds move anywhere else? So if I sent from Bank A to Bank B, you need Bank B to confirm that it hasn't gone to Bank C, D, E, and F. And if it has, you need to identify who those banks are. They're not going to give you account information because they can't under privacy rules, but you have to identify where they've gone. Then you got to file the IC3 complaint at the FBI. It takes a few minutes. I won't go over all this, but you have to have the transaction level information to input in that system, okay? Who you are, the financial institution, you got to select wire transfer, who the subject's name was, how you were victimized, the email header. They want the detail because what they're doing is they're seeing all these different complaints, and it might be a similar syndicate or account that they're tracking already. But you have to have an IC3 complaint on file within that first hour. And then retain the complaint number because you're going to need it when you contact the local FBI field office, okay? Notify your bank, IC3 complaint, hour 1. Hour 2, go to the field office, call them, and contact somebody that is in the cyber crimes or complex financial crimes unit and make a connection there and let them know what's going on, okay? Here's a link. There's also a link to the white paper. By each county in each state, we're providing you the direct contact information for each FBI field office. Now, they may not, like Grand Rapids, for example, in Michigan, the actual center is through Detroit. So you have to ask, do you process it here, or is there a larger hub that's centralized within the state or the region? Some states are sharing because of borders, one office that crosses different states. And then share with the special agent what you know, the complaint number, and align expectations. What can I expect from you in the next few hours as you look into this? You're going to call me back, you're going to email me, you're going to be radio silent. Align those expectations, okay? And then contact legal counsel. In that white paper, I give you a redacted, but a roadmap, if you will, for an injunctive order. What's an injunctive order? An injunctive order is where you walk into your local court with the paperwork to ask a judge to sign off on an order that you can serve on the banks that would restrict them from moving the funds any further or transferring from the account that they're holding it in to another institution, or even pulling. You need to freeze the account. You can do that through an injunctive order, maybe, depending on the jurisdiction. We were fortunate enough that I learned of our fraud at 11 a.m. in the morning and on a Tuesday morning, and we were walking out and had served an injunctive order on 4 different banks by 4:30 that afternoon, okay? And that was critical to our recovery. Hour 3, contact all the banks in the chain. So now you circle back to your bank and you say, okay, what has the fraud prevention desk learned over the last couple hours, and has the recall notice, or I call a fraud alert, been issued against the bank accounts where your money may have ended up? And it's shocking how quickly you can get from 1 to 3 to maybe 5 accounts spread around the country that your money has dropped into. Again, share the contact information and align expectations. So now you're at the bank. What are you doing? What can I expect over the next 2 or 3 or 4 hours? This isn't days, guys. This is like right now. What can I expect? And then you actually have a duty, if you have errors and omissions or cyber or anything like that, you have a duty to notify your carrier that an incident took place, especially if you have wire fraud coverage, if you have social engineering coverage, if you have cyber crime or general crime coverage, if you have third-party loss coverage. It goes on and on, right? But they may want to engage and may have a team to help engage and minimize the loss as well. So hour 4, now contact your local authorities. Well, why are you saying that? Why wouldn't I go down to the local police station and let them know what's going on? Minutes matter in this, guys, and this is why I'm saying, look, if you can get through hours 1 through 3, all those steps in the first hour, awesome. Then go to local authorities. But by the time your money moves state lines, typically the jurisdiction, at least what we found, your city, your county, and your state level jurisdiction, truly to prosecute and draw this thing to a close, has been lost once it transfers from one bank to another in another state. But it's good to have a police report, share the contact information, and read them into what's going on. They may be able to help. In our case, they weren't, but I'm not saying that you don't have some. I did hear Kent County helped a couple in a pretty big way because they were able to engage the FBI and kind of do steps 1 to 2 because they knew what the roadmap was. And that was really impressive because it's pretty complicated. And then hour 5 is, all right, we got to figure out what's going on. Like, where was the breach? Were we breached? How did this fraud take place? Is there something that we need to be aware of that, you know, do I got to take the system down and do an analysis or what? So, you know, determine the source, contact either your internal or your external teams and explain the situation and take a full image of the actual database, because you're going to be asked for this if there's a trial, in our case, 3 years down the road, where they asked for all the information we had on everything. And then maybe even a forensic investigator to come in and do a deeper dive on what the impact is with the environment. Because you don't want something, wire fraud may be the tip of the iceberg. Somebody may have gotten in, inserted malware or other software that's kind of latent in the system, and they're just starting to mine information. You got to make sure that those bad guys and those programs are thrown out automatically. So, main takeaways. If you're going through the process, details will come quickly typically, or should come quickly if you're really advocating hard for yourself and your customer, but the money is going to come back rather slowly. And I say that because you think about it. Transfer funds, you voluntarily transfer funds to an account. You didn't involuntarily, there wasn't a gun to your head. So they voluntarily went to an account that you find out was a illegal or an unlawful or an unconsented transfer because the account was bogus or fraudulent. That puts the banks in an awkward legal situation because you're asking them to just push the money back to you, but there's no due process there. Well, I need to hear from the other guy, because what would happen if I claim a fraud on a legitimate transfer? We just started wiring money back to people. That's another fraud vector that they could do, right? So be prepared to indemnify the bank to return your funds. What does that mean? The bank is going to send you an indemnity letter that says, look, I'm kind of taking your word for it. I see everything lines up. Now that we look at this account a little bit more, it seems suspicious, but you're going to have to sign something that if you're wrong, you will make us whole. Not just on the amount that we send back to you, but on litigation fees, if we're sued, if blah, 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 blah. And guess what? You're going to have to sign it. They're not going to negotiate. I haven't found any bank that would negotiate on this because everything's happening so fast. And then don't trust anyone. So the fraudsters are so good that when they notice a fraudulent transfer comes in, they may proactively call you or someone in your organization that says, hey, you know, hey, Tim, I'm Tom from ABC Bank. I saw this wire transfer come in. We've actually flagged that because it looks a little bit suspicious. So just let you know that our fraud department and our risk team is looking into it, and we'll be in contact with you in the next few hours. And then a few hours goes by and they call back and say, you know what, we're still digging into this. We have some other transfers we're trying to figure out. I'll probably give you a call first thing tomorrow morning. How does 9 o'clock look? And by that time, guys, they've bought themselves the time they need to splinter out and convert the funds so that you can't have a recovery. I'm not saying a bank won't legitimately call you. I'm just saying be very suspect of a bank proactively calling and saying, hey, I noticed something and I'm here to help. Just be very suspect. So the action item, and I cannot stress this enough, is to put a process in place where you run the traps on this in advance of it happening to you. So you've got to take this information, take a step back and say, okay, what if I was hit with a fraud at 12:30 today? Would we be prepared? Who would run point? Who do I call, right? Who's responsible? So you have to have the preparedness, who to report to, a response plan. I mean, all these three things. Frankly, knowing what I know now, I would sit down with, if I have an escrow account, I'd be sitting down with every single bank that is holding some of our escrowed funds, and many of you have multiple escrow accounts, and I get it. It's hard to manage, but I get it. But I would be sitting down with their fraud team and their risk department to say, okay, assuming I had to call you, or I just realized of a wire fraud, what do I do to maximize your engagement to go through this process, and what can I expect from an information sharing standpoint? And then get a commitment in what I call create a red phone to red phone link to your banking institution. I would do the same thing with the FBI. So I'd find that local field office, even if you got to show up in person and create relationships matter like anything else, guys. And if you humanize yourself and you create a relationship in advance, I'm not guaranteeing anything, but I would suspect that you may be able to get a little more activity or treatment faster because you've created a relationship and at least you've set up kind of the rules of engagement. The other thing is with your insurance carrier, your clauses are very specific and none of us read them, that what is the claim response reporting requirement in your policy so that they can't deny you if you sat on it too long where they could have stepped in. A lot of those policies say, look, I have a right to defend. I might want to step in here and make sure that we mitigate what could be a risk profile for us to try to actively recover these funds. And then the same thing with legal counsel and your IT department. So do you have a post-incident response plan that includes all these things? Banking, the authorities, the IT, who is, what's the red phone to red phone internally if something were to happen so you can start moving quickly. I'll say this, if a wire fraud hits, and I hope it never, ever does, guys, you're gripped with this fear and this energy, and it's almost like an aura. It's like a blind spot almost. But you can't stay there more than a few minutes before you start to engage and activate. When minutes matter is the white paper. So I would definitely download this, digest it, train on it for your key incident response folks, and then give it to your key referral partners. They need to know also, because you can't collect for a broker or a real estate agent that may have had a client wire funds, but you could guide them through the process of what to do, and you can't because you're not the account holder. All right, so monthly briefings. We've had an awesome first quarter. Now that we're into April, I was super excited to share this. It's only going to get, like I say, as or more intense as we go through the year. We're going to talk about arming the workflow to prevent fraud. We'll have a special guest that will provide some real tactical advantages on how to educate employees and referral partners, and some folks that I heard speak in Raleigh last week. I'll see if I can elicit them to participate in half that. We'll have some stats come out from the FBI on business email compromise and wire fraud loss. I'm anticipating those will come out late next month, early June. We'll spin those up and share those with you. Still working on our next white paper, which is recent court decisions on wire fraud losses and where the liability lines fall. And then we'll talk about insurance and then data security. So if you have any other topics, we're always open to those. I can triage these accordingly. But again, I hope you found this information useful. One of the things that I'll leave with this. One of the main themes that came out of the wire fraud conference earlier this week is to slow down. We have to slow roll some of these decisions, and we have to read all the information with more of a critical eye. Okay, so we were unpacking, countless phishing examples in the last few days to show just these little nuances of how it could have been picked up as the fraudsters coming in. The other is we have to educate our consumers earlier in the process that wire fraud is an issue and what to watch out for. So if you look at the court cases around the country that either are being decided or pled or in kind of the process of being decided, one of the main themes is we have as an industry, and I'm talking about brokerage, title, legal and financial services, including mortgage, we have an obligation to identify this as a risk that's on the shoulders or kind of at the doorstep of our customers. And if we don't do that in a timely way, in a comprehensive way, that's where that liability could ultimately shift over to one or all of us where we have to pay for the loss. So I hope you found this helpful. I'm going to take a few questions. I know I'm running a little bit over from what we normally do. Will a link to the presentation be distributed? We get this question every time. Absolutely. You're going to get it, I think, within about 3 hours. So you'll get it kind of mid-afternoon today. Feel free to use it, train against it, whatever you'd like. What are the risks of accepting cashier's checks? So we get this question all the time. Cashier's checks are great if they're drawn on the right institution. Okay, if we think wire fraud's a problem, so if wire fraud's this big, check fraud is like this big. Okay, so the challenge, if you're in a table-funded state and not an escrow state, is with cashier's checks. If I'm taking a cashier's check in at closing, and I know that, I'm taking that in, I'm going to deposit it, it's likely not going to clear the Federal Reserve for between 3 and 7 days, depending on where it's drawn. That's what we learned. It's no different than a personal check these days. There's no such thing as certified funds anymore. It's the same as a starter check. So you just have to season that in your account, make sure it's fully ironclad clear, cleared through the Federal Reserve before you wire against it. Because, the dirty secret is I take in a check and then I wire out a few hours later. I'm not wiring funds off that check. I'm wiring funds off a check that had cleared, yesterday or the day before. Somebody else's, it's a float, right? And it's a float to the tune of a ton of money every single month. So that's the risk. Haven't found the ability, because we've searched, we take so many in, haven't found the ability to certify the sequence, the integrity, and whether or not the check has absolute good funds. So we deposit it and we have to let it season for 10 days. If we have a bank, okay, Tom, that's great, but pragmatically, if we know the lender or we know the banker and they're coming to the closing and they're presenting the check, you're in a much better state than if it's coming in a mail away or it's coming just randomly through an overnight or an envelope or something like that. So that's a great question. What are the chances of recovery these days with all the wire fraud instances? So again, we have to have a little bit of empathy and grace. The FBI is inundated. This is the fastest growing cyber crime in the U.S. They're just slammed with inquiries every single day. Do not be surprised that if your fraud does not amount to, I'm going to say, at least $1 million, possibly $2 million, they're not going to prosecute the person that stole your $50,000 or $250,000. They just don't have the bandwidth to do it. Now, what we found is our syndicate was responsible for over $3 billion in fraud attempts over a 5-year period. So I was mashed into a much larger silo, if you will, with other victims, and that's how we ultimately got prosecution. Desmond was sentenced last week, I think it was Friday, and from the bench, the federal bench, the judge had noted that this was simply the worst that he had ever seen as far as financial crime. And actually, a quote came over that said there was just simply no links that they wouldn't go to defraud people from their funds. So what I experienced and what these people are doing, they just simply won't stop. So again, I want to wrap up. If we have not connected, let's connect on LinkedIn. I'm constantly putting little 60, 90-second videos on topics that are trending. If you want to reach out and talk about how we can, guarantee the safe wire of wire transfers for incoming, outgoing funds, but also lower your litigation risk profile through standard email templates in your workflow, I'd love to talk about that because we're taking that to next level right now. Until then, have a safe month. I know that we're off the spring market right now, and there's a lot more activity out there. Hopefully the refinances with rate drops will start to kick in as well. And I hope you guys stay safe, and we'll see you in May. Take care.